Welcome to our deep dive into Good Economics for Hard Times. It's a book by Nobel laureates Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. And, it tries to tackle this question. Can economics actually solve the world's toughest problems? It feels like every time economists come up with a solution, a new problem just pops up.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the authors totally get that, you know. Right
Yeah.
from the start they say, "Hey, we know there's kind of a growing distrust of economics, especially after like the 2008 crisis,
Uh,
right?" And they actually use that skepticism as a jumping off point to show, "Hey, what can economics do when it's done right? When it's based on, good data and evidence, what can we actually do?"
Okay, so they're not shying away from the critics. They're kind of leaning into it.
Yeah, exactly.
I like that. But where do they even begin? What's the first thing they jump into?
Well, they tackle some really hot button issues, right? And I think one of the first ones is immigration. You've probably heard, I mean, everyone's heard the arguments against it. Immigrants are stealing jobs, they're driving down wages. But Banerjee and Duflo use data to actually dismantle these myths. So, for example, they highlight a study in Denmark where after this big influx of refugees, native workers actually saw their wages increase.
How is that possible?
Right. It seems counterintuitive.
Right. Is like the opposite of what you'd expect.
Exactly. And what they find is the refugees often took on different types of jobs than the native workers. So they actually kind of filled these gaps in the labor market. And that freed up native workers to kind of move into more specialized, higher paying roles. And so it really demonstrates like the dynamic nature of an economy, right?
Uh-huh.
And how, it challenges that fixed pie mentality.
Oh, I see. So it's not a zero-sum game where if one person wins, the other loses.
Exactly.
There's actually potential for everyone to benefit.
Yeah. And what's even, I think, more interesting is it's not just about debunking these myths, right? The authors also really stress the need for smart integration policies, things like language training and job placement programs, because those things not only help immigrants thrive, but they also make sure that immigrants can contribute fully to, their new communities.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's kind of a win-win.
Exactly.
Now, another topic they tackle is trade. And obviously free trade has been this huge, engine for lifting millions out of poverty globally.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
Absolutely. And Banerjee and Duflo, they acknowledge that right away. They say, look, trade creates winners and losers. And I think the problem is the gains are often very diffuse, they're spread out. But the losses can be highly concentrated in specific industries, Like imagine, a small town where the main employer is this textile factory and it shuts down because of cheaper imports, right? That's what economists call a trade shock. And it has this devastating impact on people's livelihoods in these local communities.
Yeah, and we've seen that happen, in the U.S. and in other countries with
Yeah.
manufacturing jobs moving overseas. So what do they propose? Do they say we need to bring back protectionist measures?
Actually, not at all. They argue that protectionism, putting up these barriers, actually hurts everyone in the long run. What they propose instead is this concept called compensating the losers.
Compensating losers. So what does that look like in practice?
So it means doing things like having targeted interventions. For example, retraining programs for workers who've been displaced by trade, wage subsidies to help them transition into new jobs, and strengthening the social safety net. Making sure people don't fall through the cracks. Essentially, it's about saying, look, free trade, yeah, based on comparative advantage, it's generally good, it's beneficial, but we need to have policies in place that kind of cushion the blow for those who are negatively affected by it.
It's about making sure the system is more fair.
Yeah, exactly.
And that kind of brings us to another major theme of the book, right, which is inequality. And, they don't just state the problem of inequality, they go deeper.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things that's most fascinating about this book, right? They really go beyond just stating the obvious. For example, they completely dismantle this myth of trickle-down economics, right? This idea that tax cuts for the wealthy will somehow magically benefit everyone, like stimulate the economy and everyone's going to be better off.
Right.
They use hard data to show that that's just not how it works in reality. Wealth doesn't trickle down, it tends to kind of stay concentrated at the top.
They have this really cool analogy in the book. They talk about a bathtub, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they say, imagine a bathtub with a small drain at the bottom and a faucet pouring in water at the top. The faucet is like the wealth flowing to the top earners, and the drain is any benefits that might be trickling down. And if the faucet's pouring in way more water than the drain can handle, the tub just overflows.
That's a great analogy. I love that.
And that represents the concentrated wealth at the top, while very little actually reaches the bottom.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the problem with trickle-down economics. It just assumes that these benefits will flow down. But, as they show in the book, that's not really how it works. The consequences are pretty big, right? Not just for those at the bottom, but for the economy as a whole.
So it's not just a moral issue, it's actually an economic issue.
Precisely. They argue that high levels of inequality actually hinder overall growth. They undermine, social cohesion, and they can even weaken democracies
Oh, wow.
because you're creating a system where opportunities are limited for many people, and that hinders innovation, productivity, all these things that we need for a healthy economy.
So what's the solution? What do they propose we do about it?
Well, they advocate for a combination of policies, including things like progressive taxation, where the wealthy pay a larger share, stronger social safety nets to kind of protect the vulnerable, and investments in education and job training to promote social mobility. It's really about creating a more level playing field so that everyone has a chance to succeed, regardless of their background.
So it's about tackling inequality from multiple angles.
Exactly. And one specific policy they explore in detail is universal basic income, or UBI. It's gained a lot of traction, right? As a potential solution to poverty and, a lot of the challenges we see with automation and all this. But Banerjee and Duflo, they actually really delve into the nuances of this idea, right? It's not just as simple as, okay, let's give everyone a check. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, there's got to be a lot of factors to consider. What's their take on it?
They present, I think, a pretty balanced view. They acknowledge both, the potential benefits and the challenges. So on one hand, right, UBI could be amazing, right? It could provide this safety net for everyone. It could reduce poverty. It could even give people the freedom to kind of, pursue their passions or, start their own businesses. There's a lot of potential upside.
That does sound pretty appealing, especially, these days, it feels like job security is less and less of a sure thing, right?
Exactly. But then there's the practicality, right? Okay, how do you actually fund a program that's massive? I mean, some people propose things like, okay, we'll have a value-added tax or carbon tax, but those have their own, economic implications. And then there's the question of, work incentives, will people still be motivated to work if they just have this guaranteed income coming in?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Do they address that in the book?
Yeah, they do. They actually point to some UBI experiments. There have been a bunch of them, in places like Finland and Kenya. And the results have been kind of mixed, right? In some cases, you saw a slight increase in people's well-being and entrepreneurship, but no significant decrease in overall employment.
So it sounds like, yeah, the jury's still out on UBI, but it's something that we need to look into more, right?
Absolutely. And that's what I really appreciate about their approach, right? It's this really careful analysis, relying on evidence, not ideology. And that also comes up in their discussion of climate change.
Oh, interesting. Climate change and economics. What's the connection?
Well, they frame climate change not just as an environmental crisis, but also a very real economic issue, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. We're already seeing economic impacts, right?
Yeah.
Extreme weather events, supply chains getting disrupted,
Yeah.
coastal communities being threatened by rising sea levels.
Exactly. And those impacts, they disproportionately affect, developing countries and low-income communities, the people who have the least resources to actually adapt.
That's, yeah, definitely not fair at all.
Yeah.
Do they offer any solutions? What do they say we should do about it?
They're actually pretty critical of the current international agreements, the Paris Climate Accord. They
Yeah.
say, look, this is not enough, right? We need bolder, more coordinated action. And they really highlight the potential of what they call a green economy.
What's a green economy?
It's where, we invest in renewable energy, we invest in energy efficiency, we invest in sustainable infrastructure. And what they argue is that this can actually create jobs, boost economic growth, and reduce carbon emissions all at the same time.
So it's not about choosing between the economy and the environment.
Exactly. It's about finding solutions that actually achieve both.
It's kind of like having your cake and eating it too.
Yeah. And that focus on pragmatism, on evidence-based solutions, you see that throughout the book, even in their analysis of social programs.
So they talk about welfare programs and things like that.
Yeah. They get into this age-old debate, right, of targeted versus universal programs. So targeted programs, think food stamps, housing assistance, things like that. They're meant to help very specific groups of people who are in need. But universal programs, things like universal health care or free college tuition, those are available to everyone, no matter their income.
It seems like both approaches have pros and cons, right?
Sure.
So which side do they come down on?
They actually make a pretty strong argument in favor of universal programs. They say, yeah, they might be more expensive up front, but they can be way more effective in the long run.
Okay, why is that?
Well, for one thing, they're simpler to administer, right? You don't need all this complicated, like, means testing, to figure out who's eligible and who's not. It's just less bureaucratic, less red tape.
Yeah.
So it's easier for people to actually access the benefits.
That makes sense. If it's easier to get the help, more people will actually get it.
Right. And it avoids a lot of the stigma that's often associated with these targeted programs. Like, if everyone's eligible, there's no shame in taking advantage of the program,
Oh.
right? And that can lead to higher take-up rates and ultimately better outcomes. Like, they have this really cool example from India where there was this program that provided free school uniforms to all children, regardless of income. And it actually led to a huge increase in school enrollment, especially among girls.
Wow, so just something as simple as a school uniform.
Exactly. It's like a small intervention, but it had this ripple effect and led to this big social change.
It's pretty amazing how these seemingly small things can have such a huge impact.
And that's something that really comes across in this book. It's not always about these grand, sweeping policies. Sometimes it's about finding those specific, like, pressure points, right? Where, a well-designed program can really make a difference.
It's interesting. They really seem to emphasize this idea of humility in policymaking.
Yeah, it's refreshing, right? They're basically saying, look, economists don't have all the answers. We need to be more experimental. Let's test different solutions, gather data, and actually adjust course based on what works, not just our ideological assumption.
Yeah. Be willing to admit when you're wrong and change course.
Exactly. And that's, a hard thing to do, especially for, like, policymakers. But they argue it's absolutely essential if we want to tackle these big, complex challenges like poverty, climate change, inequality.
This book has really made me think differently about economics. It's not just about, like, maximizing profits or GDP growth. It's about using, our understanding of economics to create a world that's more fair, more equitable, and more sustainable.
Absolutely. And, they also delve into this, like, really fascinating topic about the future of work in an age of automation. It's something that generates a lot of anxiety for people. But I think Banerjee and Duflo, they offer a really nuanced perspective on it.
It seems like everyone's worried about robots taking their jobs, right?
Yeah.
What do they say about that?
They acknowledge that, yeah, automation's going to disrupt certain sectors, especially manufacturing, but they kind of push back against this idea of, like, mass unemployment.
So it's not going to be like Terminator.
Not exactly. They argue that new jobs are going to emerge, just like they always have throughout history, right? As technology changes, new jobs pop up. The challenge is to make sure that we adapt and that we prepare workers for these new roles.
So it's about reskilling and retraining, right?
Exactly. We need to invest in education and training programs that really give people the skills they need to thrive in this rapidly changing labor market.
Makes sense. But what about, the people who might get left behind?
That's a really important point. And they suggest some pretty innovative solutions, things like wage subsidies. So basically, supporting workers in low-wage industries that might be particularly vulnerable to automation. And these subsidies could help, like, bridge the income gap and kind of provide a safety net for people during this transition.
So it's about recognizing that, yeah, technological change is going to happen, but we have a responsibility to make sure that it benefits everyone, not just a select few.
Precisely. We want a future of work where everyone has a chance to thrive, not just the tech elite.
Reading this book has really made me rethink some of my assumptions about economics. It's not just about, like, cold, hard numbers,
Yeah.
It's about people. It's about their lives, their choices, their struggles. And this book has really highlighted that human side of economics.
And that brings us to, kind of their concluding thoughts, right? Where they talk about, what's the path forward? What do we do with all this?
As we kind of wrap up our deep dive into good economics for hard times, I'm left with this, like, I don't know, sense of cautious optimism. Like, they don't sugarcoat anything, right? The book acknowledges all the challenges, all the problems, but it's also like, hey, we have agency. We can actually do something about this.
Yeah,
right?
I totally agree. I think for me, what really struck me is their, like, this belief they have, this unwavering belief in the power of good economics,
Yeah.
Not economics like how do we, maximize profits, or how do we just maintain the status quo, but economics as a tool for actually making the world a better place.
I think that's a really important
Yeah.
distinction.
Yeah.
It's about like moving away from just these purely financial metrics and thinking about well-being more broadly.
Exactly. And you see that throughout the entire book, right?
Right.
Whether they talk about immigration, trade, social programs. It's like recognizing that the economy isn't just this like abstract thing, detached from our lives.
Yeah.
It's the system that shapes our opportunities, our access to resources, how we live our lives.
It's so true. And one of the things that really stuck with me was this emphasis on evidence-based policymaking, which just sounds so obvious, right? But it feels like so much like the political discourse these days is driven by like ideology and not actual data.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, but I think Banerjee and Duflo offer a really powerful antidote to that, They're basically showing how rigorous research, careful analysis can actually lead to solutions that work. Think about how they talked about UBI, right? Universal basic income. They didn't just like jump on the bandwagon and say, this is the answer to everything.
Yeah.
They actually looked at it carefully. They weighed the potential benefits, the challenges, They looked at real world experiments and they were like, we need to keep exploring this. We need more evidence.
I love that because it's like, you don't have to have all the answers, right? But you got to be willing to like experiment, to try things out, to be willing to admit when you're wrong and then change course based on what you learn.
Yeah, and that requires, like a certain humility. And they talk about this in the book, that humility is often lacking, especially in the field of economics.
It's so true. Like they really challenge this image of like the economist as this all-knowing expert,
Right.
Instead, they're saying, hey, we need to be more collaborative. We need to listen to different perspectives to the people who are actually being impacted by these policies.
Yeah, and that, for me, was one of the most powerful messages of the book, right? It's like remembering that economics should be about serving people, not the other way around.
So where do we go from here? Like, what can we do? I mean, we're just two people having this conversation. But what can we, like, as individuals do to actually create this, more just and sustainable economic future?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? And the book doesn't give us like a step-by-step guide. It's not like, here are the 10 things you need to do. But I think it gives us these really powerful tools, a better understanding of these complex issues, an appreciation for the importance of data and evidence, and this like renewed belief that positive change is actually possible.
It's about like getting involved, right? Having these conversations, educating ourselves, and like, demanding better from our leaders.
Yes. And don't underestimate the power of like just your own voice, speak up, share what you've learned, demand action from the people who have the power to make these changes.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, our challenge to you, the listener, is this. Take what you've learned and apply it to your own life, whether that's having conversations about inequality or supporting policies that, promote sustainable development, or even just being a more informed consumer. We all have a role to play in building a better economic future.
We really do. And I think the most important thing is to remember, like, the economy isn't this fixed, immutable thing. It's a system that we created. And if we created it, we can change it.
So that's it for our deep dive into good economics for hard times. We hope you enjoyed it and, maybe learned a thing or two. And most importantly, that it sparked some curiosity, and inspired you to like learn more about this fascinating world of economics.
Thanks for joining us.